Welcome to Battle Historica, ladies and gentlemen, where we dissect the great battles throughout history, and core blimey do we have a behemoth of a battle here. In 1815, a field in Belgium would host one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. In this episode we'll be delving into the history and strategies of two of the great titans of war and how they met on the battlefield one summer's day. I am of course talking about the brilliant Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington. Both men would play a day's game of 4D chess to desperately outwit one another to rule the day and ultimately shape the maps of Europe, if not the world. Don't take any of that for granted. There were plenty of opportunities for this battle to have a different outcome to alter what we call history. We'll go into all of them, the build-up, the tactics, the shortcomings and the decisions made. The Battle of Waterloo. Now, growing up, I was told there were always three inescapable truths to life: death, tax, and the sheer inability to invade Russia during winter, something Napoleon Bonaparte had to learn the hard way in 1812. After 8 years of battles and gained ground, the Emperor of Europe, although heavily advised not to, decided to invade the country of Russia, initially taking in a force of 600,000 men. And with a combination of battles and the Baltically cold Russian winter, only around 30,000 would ever return. Now, I could never do Napoleon's rise to power and the subsequent failed invasion of Russia the due diligence it deserves in a short section here. But it's definitely worth noting though to understand just how powerful this man was at the beginning of the 19th century. So basically, Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the 15th of August 1769 in Corsica, Italy, to a modest family with loose ties to Italian nobility. And at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, he was already part of its military as an artilleryman, with eventually becoming a general at the age of 24. He was given his first military campaign just 2 years later against the Austrians, to which he never lost a battle, and soon after led a successful campaign in Egypt. Then, in 1799, he was named First Consort of France after a coup d'etat against the French Directory, basically ending the French Revolution. And then a few years later, in 1804, he would be crowned as Emperor of France. Throughout the next 10 years, he went about expanding his empire through mainland Europe, and throughout a fierce campaign of fighting and expansion, he was slowly becoming the most powerful man in the world. Eventually, though, all good things must come to an end. With his failed attempt at invading Russia and a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Leipzig, Napoleon's enemies had now driven him back to Paris. The French people weren't too happy with him either. He had them in countless wars for the last decade, and with the French Revolution prior to that, it seemed a whole generation knew nothing but war. And knowing he had run out of options, he agreed to sign his abdication. The European allies he had fought against agreed he could live, but as an exile. Napoleon would have to spend the remainder of his days ruling a small island in the Mediterranean Sea called Elba. Of his massive armies he once commanded, he would only be allowed a small protection force of 1,000 men made up from his imperial guard to take with him, and in his place, the monarchy would return to France in the name of King Louis XVIII. It appears for now that Napoleon had finally been defeated. And so, Napoleon, guarded by the British and French Navy, stewed in his new kingdom. Although considerably smaller than his last, in true Napoleonic fashion, he set to work to enrich his and his subjects' quality of life. He set out to build roads, hospitals and schools, and to generally improve the living standards for everyone living on his island. There was, however, a thorn in his side. As part of his abdication, King Louis XVIII had promised an annual subsidy of 2 million francs a year for the emperor to rule his island. Yet, it soon became apparent no money would be paid. This severely depressed Napoleon. Without his ability to provide for his people, he descended into a blatant depression. Mulling over his past conquests, he sat around growing bitter at his current situation. Not only were there both the British and French Navy vessels guarding Elba, on the island itself was also the British officer Sir Neil Campbell, who was tasked with ensuring the oversight of the Emperor. He had been convinced Napoleon had accepted his fate. With reporting back to London, I begin to think he has quite resigned to his retreat. This, however, was all part of Napoleon's ruse. He had been monitoring the situation back in France and seeing the French people becoming more and more frustrated in their newly appointed monarch in King Louis XVIII, with higher taxes and mass unemployment. It was becoming apparent the ones who once praised Napoleon's departure from their country were now showing signs of their regret. And so, in February 1815, he began his plans. His largest ship, the Inconstant, in his diminished navy was ordered to be transformed from the French brig it once was to resemble something similar to a British ship. Then, when Sir Neil Campbell's business led him to Italy, and using the British ship Partridge, which was usually used to guard Napoleon's waters around Elba, sailed to Leghorn, where his mistress lived, I might add. From then, with Sir Neil gone and the Partridge away from Elba, Napoleon, on the 26th of February 1815, with his newly converted Inconstant ship along with 2 more and his 1,000 troops, set sail and left Elba. And on the 28th, just 2 days later, Napoleon landed in the south of France with the news of finally reaching Paris. This infuriated the king, who went to Napoleon's former Marshal of France, Marshal Ney, and ordered him to stop his advance. Ney, who wanted to keep favour and show loyalty to the king, accepted, saying, "I shall bring him back in an iron cage." Marshal Ney's 5th Regiment then left Paris and both armies headed towards one another, finally meeting on the 7th of March just south of the city of Grenoble. This is where we see the true brilliance of Napoleon's appeal and just how much he was loved by his people. Both armies faced one another, Napoleon facing the army and commander he once ruled, unseated from his horse, and simply said, "Here I am, kill your emperor if you wish." There was a tense silence, no one fired, both armies just looked at one another. Then, "Vive l'Empereur," all the troops started shouting. Napoleon's gamble had worked. He knew he had the respect of the people, and when push came to shove, those people showed their true colours. Napoleon now had an even bigger army, and after embracing Marshal Ney, both men now marched on Paris. Honestly, they say truth is stranger than fiction, and this was absolutely nuts. Each time an army was sent down to stop Napoleon, the troops would simply just throw down their arms and rally to him. And by the time Napoleon had reached Paris on the 20th of March, he had accumulated close to 200,000 men in his army, and King Louis XVIII, having read the writing on the wall, fled to Belgium. And now, for the second time in a generation, France was once again under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. So now, with Napoleon in Paris receiving a hero's welcome, over in Vienna, something important was happening. For the past few months, a congress had been convening in Vienna with the purpose of reorganising the maps of Europe and the balance of power after the Napoleonic Wars they had just fought in. And in attendance were all the powers of Europe, all wanting their piece of the pie. It was a squabbling affair. For months, little ground had been made, as all nations couldn't or wouldn't concede any ground, with the 4 main powers doing most of the bickering. There was Prince Metternich representing Austria, Count Karl Robert Nesselrode representing Russia, Prince Karl August von Hardenberg for Prussia, and recently appointed for Great Britain Sir Arthur Wellesley, also known as the Duke of Wellington. And when on the 6th of March they received a letter saying, "The English Commissioner Campbell entered the harbour asking whether anyone had seen Napoleon at Genoa, in view of the fact he had disappeared from the island of Elba, the answer being in the negative, the English frigate put to sea without further delay." The letter instantly caused the bickering nations to put their differences aside and galvanise them around the idea of Napoleon's return. Initially, they hadn't thought the Emperor would have dared to return to France, as the feeling was he would be torn to pieces by the French people, as they had seen just how much they disliked him during his initial abdication. And for days they pondered on the idea where he might have gone to, until they finally realised Napoleon had in fact returned to Paris. It didn't take long for the 4 nations to declare war. Not against France, for all they were concerned, France was still a monarchy, and Napoleon was nothing more than a usurper taking the throne away from King Louis XVIII. They then instead declared war on Napoleon himself. All four nations then pledged to assemble an army of 150,000 men to stop Napoleon. The Russians and Austrians' armies would take time to mobilise, so the Duke of Wellington would decide it's best, and with the approval from London, take charge of the British and Dutch forces, along with a coalition of European nations. And by the 6th of April, he would be in Brussels, just 160 miles from the newly crowned Emperor of Europe. And since the Austrians and Russians needed time to organise their armies, it was for now down to the British led by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher to try and stop Napoleon. Blücher, at 74 years old, was loved by his men. He had the nickname Marshal Forwards, as he was often seen at the fronts of his ranks during battles shouting for his men to press on. Blücher knew the threat of Napoleon was all too real for Prussia not to intervene, and so also positioned his army around Brussels. He took more of the eastern side, as if he needed to retreat. That was the safest and quickest way back to Prussia, with eventually camping himself at Namur. And when it comes to the Duke of Wellington against Napoleon Bonaparte, well, they might be very much different sides of a coin, but that coin was definitely versed in the art of war. Napoleon had conquered most of Europe in his prime. His strategy had always been to strike first, divide his enemies, and whilst holding one side down, commence a fierce attack on the other, and once that side had been destroyed, concentrate on the remainder. He knew he was good. He saw war almost as a boxing match. He who could basically hit the hardest would ultimately triumph. Now he could have stayed in Paris, fortified his position, trained his army to higher numbers and wait for the attack. But this was Napoleon Bonaparte. He didn't wait for the attack, he was the attack. The Duke of Wellington, though, knew this. He had studied Napoleon's victories during the Napoleonic Wars and was a veteran of the Peninsular War, and decided, since a good chunk of the British army was still overseas from the War of 1812 with the United States, and still waiting on the Russians and Austrians, his best strategy was to wait and see what Napoleon's first move would be. His forces guarded the western side of Brussels, with the bulk over to the west should Napoleon try to cut them off from the sea, therefore cutting their supply routes. So the Duke of Wellington and Prince Blücher had their armies spread over some 100 miles as their defensive position. They weren't even sure Napoleon was going to attack, with the two main areas causing the most headache for the two being the intersection where their two armies met, or out to the west where Napoleon could cut off the British from the sea, therefore making a retreat impossible. All they could do now was wait. It was all just a question of where. So on the 15th of June, the Duchess of Richmond hosted a ball for the Duke and his officers in Brussels, and on the eve of battle, he had little intention of sowing the seed of panic to his officers. He knew the threat was real, they knew the threat was real, and with a stiff upper lip, they danced the night away. Not only was this a reason for a relaxed atmosphere, he also had all his generals and officers along with Blücher's liaison officer Baron von Muffling in attendance. So if an order was to be given, all were close by. It was, so to speak, a good staging area for the war to come. So the big question always was, where would Napoleon attack first? And so whilst all this was happening, Napoleon made up his mind. He decided that if he attacked Wellington's right flank, cutting him off from his supplies from the sea, he could drive the British into the Prussians, therefore facing two armies, which as we now know, isn't Napoleon's style. He wanted to divide the two armies, then crush them individually. That's why on the 15th of June, the same day as the Duchess of Richmond's ball, he and his army of the north of around 120,000 men arrived at the River Sambre at Charleroi. A small force of Prussian troops was stationed at the bridge there, but were soon overrun by the advancing French and were forced to retreat. Once news reached Wellington of this, he did something rather controversial and is still being debated to this day. Nothing. He was still sceptical of his right flank to the sea. He had seen tactics like this in the past by Napoleon, and feared if he moved troops from his right to the centre, the main attack would then come from his right, and with a smaller force now protecting his flank, would ultimately cut him off from the sea, which was his biggest fear. Eventually though, as the evening progressed, no messages from his right flank about any attack came. So Wellington eventually convinced himself that the attack on Charleroi must be the main one. He then went to the Duke of Richmond and asked if he had a map. He pondered it, thinking about the next move, wondering where the Battle of Battles should be commenced. He notices a small road between the villages of Quatre Bras and Ligny. If those villages and subsequently the road between them are lost to Napoleon, it could separate himself from Blucher and the Prussians, so he would then have to hold Quatre Bras and Blucher would have to hold Ligny to keep their two armies together. So, Blucher holds his army at Ligny following his retreat from Sambre, and Wellington is sporadically trying to organise his army to march on Quatre Bras. Should either be lost, both their armies are separated. Now, never underestimate just who these men were facing. This was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a master, if not the master, at battle tactics for the time. He was reading the same maps as Wellington and Blucher. He saw the same things they saw and knew this road between them was where he could make or break their armies. So a day later, while Blucher was hankering down at Ligny and Wellington scrambled his men to Quatre Bras, he took the fight to them. So on the morning of the 16th of June, he would charge Marshal Ney, who had previously been sent to bring him back in an iron cage, to Quatre Bras with 40,000 men, whilst he would attack Blucher at Ligny with the remainder of his forces. And when Wellington arrived with his army at around 10 AM, he and Blucher met at a windmill in the village of Bure. There the two men made their plans. Blucher wanted help from Wellington should he need it. Wellington though was sceptical. He was nervous at Quatre Bras. Should it fall, there would be no hope of joining the Prussians at all, to which he famously would say to Blucher, "I will come, provided I am not attacked myself." The following day Napoleon began his attack at Ligny, and at a high price emerged victorious. Blucher had been injured and was now in retreat with his army. The question was though, why hadn't Napoleon come to his aid? Well, at the windmill in Bure, he promised the prince, "I will come if I'm not attacked myself." Unfortunately, Wellington too was under attack from Ney, and like Blucher, had been pushed back out of Quatre Bras. The two men's fears had now been realised, their two armies were separated. Now Napoleon's plan had come to fruition. He had separated his opponents, and now they were on the run. And so, on the following day, Blucher and his army had rested in the village of Mellerie, whilst the Duke did the same at Genappe, waiting to hear from Blucher, until finally, one of his officers came to him with the news. Lieutenant Colonel Sir Alexander Gordon tells the Duke Blucher is now marching on Wavre to the north, not out to the east towards Prussia. This was the news Wellington had been waiting for. Blucher was basically telling him, "We're still in the fight and will turn left to your aid when possible." Wellington would then issue a tactical retreat back to Montzejon, just south of Brussels. And whilst this was happening, Napoleon, lamenting in his victory, decided his plan was now to turn his attention to Wellington. He could have simply marched to him, and considering the licking Wellington had just received at Quatre Bras, could have easily defeated him. He, however, gave one of his generals, General Grouchy, 33,000 men, a quarter of his forces to pursue and harass Blucher up to Wavre, whilst he would take the remainder of his forces to put the nail in Wellington's coffin to his left. The Duke, however, was already at Montzejon by this time, just south of a tiny village called Waterloo. Napoleon, advancing on the retreating troops, now knows where Wellington would make his stand. In this field, south of Waterloo. So he positions his troops south of the Duke around the farmhouse of La Belle Alliance. The two armies now face one another. Nightfall came, and it would have been a long night for both men. And then, on that evening, the heavens opened. Wellington was quoted as saying it was one of the worst he had ever seen and had witnessed monsoon seasons in India. It turned fields into mud. The red of the British military uniforms ran into troops' white trousers. In other words, it was torrential. The board was now set, the pieces in position. All that remained was sunrise. So, throughout the night, both Wellington and Napoleon had been positioning their troops. Napoleon held the south whilst Wellington held the north. Wellington's strategy was to simply hold off Napoleon's attacks till Blucher could arrive from the east. That's why he chose this ground. He's positioned the majority of his troops and cavalry on the ridge overlooking the valley, yet on the reverse slope away from the battlefield, which would keep them out of the sightlines of the enemy, giving him the advantage of Napoleon not knowing where the bulk of his troops would be. Then on his flanks he had troops from the King's German Legion occupy the houses and barns at Hougoumont on his right, Papillote on his left, along with La Haye-Sainte in his centre. These garrisoned troops would anchor his positions, knowing Napoleon had to take them should he need to take the field. Napoleon, on the other hand, was on the warpath. He had heard news in the night that Blucher was retreating to the east, but now turning northward to Wavre, so he had to defeat Wellington here and now. Both armies had around the same amount of men, but Napoleon had a big advantage. Whilst Wellington had time on his side, his army was made up of a coalition of troops from all around Europe. With around 68,000 in total, there were naturally the British and the Dutch, but also troops from Hanover, Brunswick and Nassau, with Wellington himself admitting he was underconfident with their abilities. Napoleon's army of around 73,000 men, however, were seasoned veterans who largely took part in the Emperor's first campaign of Europe, which included the famous Imperial Guard here. These were Napoleon's elite troops he kept in reserve and had never been defeated in battle. The clock, however, was ticking. Napoleon's biggest problem for the moment though was the wet ground from the night before's thunderstorm. He couldn't use his cannons in such conditions as the wet mud would impede the recoil the cannons needed when firing. And one of the most devastating effects a cannonball does is when it hits the ground, not only would it destroy anything in its way, but it would then bounce onto its next target. But with the sodden ground, those cannonballs would simply just bury themselves in mud, deeply diminishing their effectiveness. So, Napoleon had to wait. He waited till around the 11 AM mark till he decided the ground was now dry enough. Then shortly after 11 AM, he made his first move. He could see the position of Wellington's troops and decided the best way to defeat him was the good old-fashioned way, with brute force. He would have to march his army up through the middle of the battlefield and crush Wellington's centre. But they were on the reverse slope of the ridge and had no idea how many men Wellington had there. He had to draw them out. So his first plan was to attack Wellington's right at the Chateau Hougoumont. This would hopefully cause Wellington to move reserves from his centre to assist the King's German Legion. Then after that, he would hopefully know what he is up against. And so, at around 11:30 AM, Napoleon sends troops on his left of about 7,000 men to take Hougoumont. They start crossing the open fields to the chateau, yet now the British cannons on the ridge behind Hougoumont have them in their sights, and so a barrage of artillery fire commences on the marching troops, yet still they stride forward. Ahead of them at Hougoumont though, around 900 men lay waiting for the coming attack, but in the woods just south of the chateau lie skirmishes of the King's German Legion. Back at the chateau though, the advancing French would be met by a barrage of musket fire by troops stationed in the orchard to the east and the main building at the centre. All everyone there could do now was hold fast and wait. And at around 11:40 the French were now in range of the skirmishers, and just to prove how experienced these soldiers were, despite being harassed by the skirmishers in the trees, they still marched on. Eventually, with the enemy drawing ever closer though, the skirmishers in the trees are now forced back to the safety of the walls inside Hougoumont. Now Foy and the French troops have the harrowing task of getting through the woods to the British. and now as they're enraged, the Allies open fire. Waves and waves of French crash against the walls of Hougoumont, yet the British still held their ground. One of the German troops even went as far as to say what he witnessed was murderous. The soldiers for now were keeping the French at bay at Hougoumont, and Wellington hadn't taken the bait. Remember, he had studied Napoleon and was prepared for such diversionary tactics, so for now his centre remained strong as it was. It still had the cover of the ridge in front of them, but at around midday, Napoleon tested their resolve. He opened up all his 246 cannons to fire on the ridge, and despite Wellington's troops' cover, some still managed to find their target though, with some sources claiming this grand battery of cannon fire lasting up to an hour. The main purpose of this was to soften up the troops of Wellington's centre, as cannon fire does a very good job of demoralising troop columns, and after this softening up, it was now time for Napoleon to strike Wellington's centre. At a little after 1 PM, 4,000 men marched towards Wellington's ridge between Papoyet and La Haye-Sainte. On their left though, an attack is commencing at Wellington's centre anchor point La Haye-Sainte. Wellington was still nervous about his right flank, so unlike Hougoumont receiving engineering work throughout the night to reinforce its defences, La Haye-Sainte had not. The theory was it would always be close enough to reinforcements in Wellington's centre that, should it need help, was always there. And speaking of Hougoumont, around this time the fight had been lasting a good few hours. The King's German Legion for now had been keeping the French at bay with massive casualties on the French side. Again at around 2 PM though, there was a slither of hope for the Napoleonic troops. Some, after marching through the open ground under fire from the British cannons above, then navigating the woods to the south coming under fire from the Allied muskets, managed to get into the orchard on the eastern side of the chateau. Not many did, but one absolute badass managed it. A Frenchman named Legros was in the small group of around 40 soldiers to find themselves in the orchard of Hougoumont that afternoon. Inside they faced the muskets and bayonets of the Allied forces. This man had just his trusty pioneer's axe, which was usually used for cutting down trees. He caused absolute bedlam for his enemies though. Instead of trees, he was now turning the German troops into kindling. The French though were ultimately defeated in that orchard, all being killed, including the madman axe-swinging Legros, only survivor being a small drummer boy the Allies let live. And now with the gates closed to the orchard, the besiegement of Hougoumont still continued. Back at Napoleon's staging area, they could see the blue uniforms advance, knowing this could be the make or break of the battle. If they could pierce Wellington's forces here, the battle could be won. Then, shortly after 2 PM, they reached the ridge. The French columns hadn't time to form into lines, and as they're mowed down by the British, who had laid and waited, were already in their lines. They knew and had the discipline to let their enemies come close to where their musket fire is most accurate, and in doing so, the French began to waver. A bayonet charge is then ordered by the British. The French, now in the very den of their enemy, eventually rout. With an about face, they scrambled down the hill, still under chase from the steel of the British bayonets. Then, as both armies crossed the open space between the two armies, the British, in what's now immortalised in tribute, sounded the charge for a cavalry attack of the Scots Greys behind them. the British cavalry had little effort to defeat the fleeing Frenchmen. They had chased them off the ridge and almost back to Napoleon himself. It seemed they had wanted to win the battle all by themselves. But battle tactics 101 of the day was always have cavalry supported by infantry. Infantry was what really won the battles and were the key to success. Getting dangerously close now to the remainder of the French army, the Duke ordered them to return back to the safety of the ridge. That call, though, came unanswered. Maybe they didn't hear it, maybe they were confused with the current onslaught, maybe they thought they had their enemy on the run and wanted the glory. We honestly just don't know. All we know is that they kept on fighting and didn't return. Napoleon saw this, so instantly sent his cavalry on his right and centre to immediately charge the British cavalry. These men and their horses riding them were a lot fresher than their British counterparts, and fortunately for them, ultimately managed to drive the British back up their ridge. There was sort of a calm over the battlefield for now. The dead and dying lay between the two armies. Napoleon's first attempt to break through the British lines had failed, and almost lost him the battle there and then. There was, however, fighting still going on. At around the same time cavalries were battling one another, the fighting at Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte continued. La Haye-Sainte was still being attacked by French troops, and the British numbers were dwindling. And things weren't looking too good at Hougoumont either. The gates to the orchard had been closed, but the French were still coming. At around 3 PM, Napoleon ordered his artillery to shell Hougoumont. Eventually, the building caught fire, which is when Wellington sent one of his famous orders to the soldiers still stationed there, who were still trying to defend the burning building. I see that the fire has communicated itself from the haystack to the roof of the chateau. You must, however, still keep your men in the parts of which the fire does not reach. Take care no men are lost by the falling in of the roofs or the floors. After they have fallen in, occupy the ruined walls inside of the garden, particularly if it should be possible for the enemy to pass through the embers on the inside of the house. They obliged, and Hougoumont remained defended by the Allies. And this is a good example as to how Napoleon and Wellington commanded their troops that day. As we just saw, Wellington was very much taking a hands-on approach. Throughout the battle, he was seen riding his horse Copenhagen throughout the various positions of his troops, and was always there to keep a close eye on things as they progressed. Napoleon, on the other hand, wanted to see the big picture. He sat himself at the tiny farmhouse in his centre, La Belle Alliance, and from there he would relay his troop movements to his generals, whilst constantly receiving updates. There was, however, something happening that most probably got him away from that farmhouse. Away to the east on Napoleon's right, troops had arrived at the village of Poissonnière. It was the Prussians. Sometime around 4:30 PM, Marshal Blucher and his men had finally made it to the battlefield. Throughout the night, their rearguard had managed to hold down General Grouchy at Wavre, and Blucher and the remainder of his forces had managed to turn west to Wellington's aid. Napoleon, now having to fight a battle on two fronts, has to now send troops from his centre to Poissonnière to hold Blucher there whilst he concentrates on Wellington. So it's now 5 PM. Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte battle still rages. Napoleon's left is in the charge of Marshal Ney, and it's at this moment he sees troops on the ridge in front of him turn and flee, to what he might presume might be due to the heavy shelling. It may be his victory at Quatre Bras, but a sudden rush of confidence filled the Marshal, and without orders from his Emperor, he sent the entire cavalry of Napoleon's left in pursuit of the fleeing Allies. It was another one of Wellington's signature moves. He had again used the reverse slope tactic he was famous for. Now though, as he had seen Ney and his cavalry crossing the open fields to his right, had ordered his men into squares. The first row of soldiers would kneel holding their bayonets out, whilst the second row would keep a continuous stream of volley fire. And because of these bayonets facing the oncoming charge, horses refused to charge them. Eventually, realising in no way could he break the British squares, Ney ordered a retreat back down the ridge. It seemed for now a second attempt to break Wellington's line had failed, and with the new fight at Poissonnière, Napoleon, it seemed, might be losing the Battle of Waterloo. So it's now 6 p.m, and although it was looking like the Duke was holding his own on his ridge, the same could not be said for his centre anchor, La Haye Sainte. Ney, who had just led the devastating attack on Wellington's left, was now charged with redemption in taking La Haye Sainte. This time though, both the infantry and cavalry would attempt it. The King's German Legion troops defending it were desperately short of ammunition and had requested more, but for some reason none ever came. The infantry attacked first. Coming up on the south, they smashed through the farm's orchard and were now at the stone walls. Meanwhile, another column of infantry come about on the left and attacked the defenders from the west. It was working. La Haye Sainte was beginning to fall. The Allies tried to get reinforcements down, but were instantly mowed down by French cavalry. And then shortly after 6 p.m, La Haye Sainte fell to the French. Of the 400 men who initially defended it, only 42 would escape. Wellington had now lost his best defensive position. No longer could its sharpshooters harass advancing French marching on the ridge behind them. And with Napoleon now moving his cannons up to La Haye Sainte, they have a much more accurate shot this time and let hell loose on Wellington's troops, causing them to fall back even further behind the ridge. It was beginning to look like now Napoleon had turned the tables of this battle. The Prussians were being kept at bay at Poissonnière, and Wellington's defences had just been severely diminished. All it needed was one big push up Wellington's centre, and he could be victorious. It's now 7 p.m. Napoleon has victory in his grasp. One last chance to take the field. If he waits to regroup all his men, the Prussians could break through and the status quo would change. He had one option left: his old guard, the ones who were undefeated, whose utter devotion and loyalty to the Emperor made them the most feared troops on the whole battlefield that day. He decided to lead them himself across the open plains to about the halfway point, then would turn back. La Haye Sainte was theirs. They had no harassment from there or Hougoumont, which was still burning. If he could break the enemy here, the tide would definitely turn. Maybe the Prussians to the east, after seeing the Allied fall, would retreat. Even not, General Grouchy would eventually arrive from Wavre with fresh troops, and together he and Napoleon could defeat the Prussians. It all depended on this ridge. Wellington has seen the advancing Imperial Guard and has ordered a strong welcome party behind the ridge, and soon the two armies would meet for one last time. Volley after volley spread throughout the two armies, but just like before, a bayonet charge was ordered. The Imperial Guard could not hold it and ultimately retreated back down the ridge. Once the rest of Napoleon's men had seen their unbeatable Imperial Guard flee, all hope had been lost, and in turn caused them to flee with them. The fighting was over. Frenchmen were fleeing. British were hot on their heels. The Prussians had now broken out of Poissonnière and were joining the Allies. There was, however, something remarkable at the French side of the field. A random square had formed amongst the chaos of the retreat, made up of the Imperial Guard. Defiantly, they stayed true to their emperor and refused to run or surrender. Heroic that may be, it was, however, futile. Some British soldiers found a random French cannon loaded, turned it around to face the defiant square, and opened fire. It was one of the last shots fired that day, and thousands now lie dead on the field. Napoleon had been defeated. There was no hope for him returning with another army. Ultimately, he would be dragged from the field by his men and escorted away in a carriage. Paris would soon learn of his defeat, and the mood again would turn sour towards the emperor. This time, though, there was no coming back. Ultimately, the Battle of Waterloo was a battle of what-ifs. We said early on there were plenty of chances for this battle to go either way. What if Napoleon had instantly sent his army to Quatre Bras after his victory at Ligny as Wellington was retreating? Could he probably have defeated him there and then? What if it hadn't rained the night before the battle and Napoleon could have started sooner, not giving time for the Prussians to arrive? And what if Marshal Ney's intemperate cavalry charge hadn't happened and the Old Guard would have had more cavalry supporting them on their attempt at Wellington's Ridge? Basically, we'll never know. Europe was now free of Napoleon and his conquests. There wouldn't be another war in Europe for 40 years, and Britain herself wouldn't fight a battle there for nearly 100 years. And the men, well, the Duke of Wellington and Blucher eventually met on the battlefield that evening around 9:30 p.m. to congratulate one another. Wellington, however, was not nearly elated as his Prussian counterpart, as he was heard later saying, "I hope to God I have fought my last battle." No joy in his work or self-admiration, what he had just achieved, to him, was nothing more than an evil necessity. Later he would become Prime Minister of Britain in 1828 and would eventually die on the 14th of December 1852, aged 83. Napoleon, on the other hand, was quashed. He would never again raise an army, and after Waterloo abdicated the throne of France once again. He surrendered to the British and exiled once more, this time though well out of the reaches of France and her new allies on the island of St. Helena off the coast of Africa. For the next 6 years he cowered there a ruined man, and on the 5th of May 1821 passed away. Now, Waterloo has been one of the most reported on battles of modern history, with hundreds of thousands of eyewitness accounts and thousands upon thousands of written documents perpetuating to that fateful day. And obviously, we shouldn't be naive enough to pretend like we have the slightest idea of what those men there witnessed, nor should I downplay the levity of a video game me and my brother just choreographed to somehow resemble what really happened. Unlike most movies today, there's no video footage depicting the brutality of it, no photos of 1,000-yard stares to show the horrors of what was witnessed. We just have the stories. Most of these stories, from both sides, talk about swashbuckling heroes and romanticised versions of stoicism. The reality, though, may seem different. Wilhelm Schutt was a surgeon for the Brunswick troops who wrote, "At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, some 100 French prisoners were brought in. One of them escaped at a favourable chance. A hussar chased him and shot him through the head with his pistol. Others ran towards him and stabbed him. Even wounded men took pieces of wood or whatever they could find and clubbed him until no single piece of him hung together." Or Edward Costello, who was wounded at Quatre Bras and after his wounds being treated in Brussels was returning to the front lines of Waterloo, witnessing desertion on a massive scale, who wrote, "Belgians and English too, with fires lighted, busily cooking, having left their comrades in contest with the enemy, there appeared to be nothing the matter with them." And all these letters should in theory give us an idea of just what these men went through. The average height of a man in the early parts of the 19th century was around the 5 foot 6 inches mark. The weapons they were using on average were around 55 inches long and weighed around 9 pounds each. I just get the feeling these men witnessed far more than is depicted in the stories and paintings we're so accustomed to with the warfare of that time period. If you really dig deep beyond the bravado of some over-enthusiastic literature, you truly hear some horrifying stories out there. Stories like Sergeant Johann Doring of the Nassau. As we passed the last building of Waterloo, placed in front of a barn was full of amputated arms and legs, some still with parts of uniforms, and the surgeons, with rolled up sleeves like butchers, were still busy at work. The scene looked like a slaughterhouse. Or Major Harry Smith here, who in my beyond naive opinion may have summed it up best. I have been over many field of battle, but with the exception of one spot at New Orleans and the breach of Badajoz, I have never seen anything to compare with what I saw. At Waterloo, the whole field from right to left was a mass of dead bodies. In one spot, to the right of La Haye Sainte, the French cuirassiers were literally piled on each other. Many soldiers not wounded lying under their horses, others fearfully wounded, occasionally with their horses struggling on their wounded bodies. The sight was sickening. All over the field you saw officers and as many soldiers as were permitted to leave their ranks, leaning and weeping over some dead or dying brothers or comrade. The battle was fought on a Sunday, the 18th of June, and I repeated to myself a verse from the psalm of that day: 1,000 shall fall beside thee, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. And after reading things like this, one does think, was it all worth it? Was it worth all the bloodshed or the carnage? And all I can think is, I don't know. I wasn't there.